welcome back. So we've discussed how a magnitude 7 to 8 earthquake can cause sand boils and these other things that we see with the sixth seal being opened, such as darkness, and how the mud flood could have been caused, and we've demonstrated that with a more current mud flood, how it buried a city, so it's hot water underneath seeking to come up. So it's basically a sand boil. So these magnitude 7 to 8 earthquakes do cause these. And also we've shown how the New Madrid earthquake has for some reason not had a lot of talk about it in our history, but it was the worst hit earthquakes in American history. So if anything did cause the mud flood, it makes sense to be here and also to be in this time frame, because we've shown how population steadily has increased since then. But before there had to have been like these mass wipes out of humanity that we're not being told about. And we can't just think that there's this slow decline like the graph shows, because Israel had at least 600,000 just after 400 years. So people were increasing back then, maybe even increasing more than they are today. So this does not explain these mass wipeouts. So then after we talk a little bit more about these earthquakes that cause these mud floods, then we want to move into who died from these. Was this the wrath of the Lamb poured out because they should not have been wiping out the original American natives? And so had they already been mostly wiped out, and also around the world, because we understand there are mud floods all around the world, had these people that still are in rule today been wiping out civilizations, and was this the wrath of the Lamb? And so does this point us further to the day of the wrath of the Lamb, where he continues to level these mountains? Because we saw that these New Madrid earthquakes, they could just be activity that is pointing back to 200 years ago or more in 1812, where it's still like tremors from that time. And then we want to look forward to what did they do after this, the survivors in America. So here it's showing a little sand boil, and it was only a 7 earthquake. So our ones with New Madrid were up to a level 8. There were 3 back to back and plus thousands over the 1811 and 1812. So then there was also large cracks in the ground that were up to about 200 meters, which we also saw with the New Madrid earthquakes. Here you can see an example of that crack. Something I am interested in is if this is the body of the feathered serpent, which you can see where my pointer is in Arkansas pointing towards the Gulf, then how did we form things like the Kentucky mountains that are very rolling like hills? And it's said that in Indiana, all the way into Indiana, this is flat here and flat here, but there's like a dome thing from where it washed down from these mountains all the way over here. How do we get rolling hills from what could be a very large corpse? So here we find a little bit more of the damage report for these New Madrid earthquakes. Black rocks as heavy as 30 pounds shot into the air through the holes that instantaneously developed in the ground. So now we can see how mountains were falling on them, but also it says mountains and rocks, not mountains and hills in our Hebrew manuscript of the sixth seal of Revelation. So then we can go down here to see this dome that formed. Several islands that had been mapped on the Mississippi River simply vanished. The subtle 15 to 30 foot rise in the terrain on which the town of Tiptonville sits, known as the Tiptonville Dome, is believed to have been made higher by the quakes. So sometimes I think these things are downplayed. Things like this could have just been an example of what was happening, and it could have just even been completely formed by this. East of Tiptonville, water poured into the swampy area that sank several feet, creating Reelfoot Lake. This map, made in 1818, does not show Reelfoot Lake yet because the mapmaker does not know it is there yet. There are many things buried inside a large river, and some of them shot out of the Mississippi. Another anonymous riverman said that near our boat, a spout of confined air, breaking its way through the waters, burst forth, and with a loud report discharged mud sticks above the surface. Large trees, which had lain for ages at the very bottom of the river, were shot up in thousands of instances, some with their roots uppermost and with their tops planted. The sulfurous vapor that Brian mentioned was a chemical released by the earth that engulfed the entire region with a fog-like covering for months. So here we can see a little bit of example of how rolling hills could be formed. In this photo taken for the 1914 book, The New Madrid Earthquake, you can see trenches and ridges formed by the New Madrid earthquake. The earth reels like a drunkard, it sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls, never to rise again. People in Hodgensville, Kentucky, felt lightheaded and reeled about like a drunken man. So here is the New Madrid fault line, and this is how far away they were. People who were closer, they could not stand up. They kept falling down. The fear of being swallowed by cracks in the ground led many people to cut trees down at right angles to the direction of the fissures previously formed, upon which they climbed for safety at times of severe shocks when new fissures were to be expected. And so following this, with the devastation, this road was said to have been constructed on July 4th, 1812, very specific date. Like, how do they know that? But there's these roads that were buried. They can be along rivers. And so in order for people to be able to travel with this new devastation, this could have been a quicker road that was able to be made. And also he shows this level of sediment where beneath this is the colony period. I apologize for my cold. I've had it for a week. So here it's called legacy sediment. So it can be very deep in places. Here is Wake Forest. To get a better idea of the scale, we can compare it to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So the area that is affected is 10 times larger with New Madrid. So also this is about the size of America. So almost everybody in America was affected or could feel this. So here is liquefaction that happened in the San Francisco earthquake, and pictures that you can see, areas affected. So we've seen how not only dome can be formed, but also how lakes can be formed. So here is a low area where the ground sank by several feet, and then it gets flooded by the Mississippi. So Subsidence, just east of the Tiptonville Dome, range from 1.5 to 6 meters, although larger amounts were reported. Other areas subsided as much as 5 meters, although 1.5 to 2.5 meters was more common. Lake St. Francis in eastern Arkansas was formed by subsidence 64 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide. Coal and sand were ejected from fissures in the swampland adjacent to the St. Francis River, and the water level is reported to have risen there by 8 to 9 meters. So, was America mostly wiped out by then? And could this be an indication of the wrath of the Lamb, where he's like, this is a phase, and he's going to complete it anytime now? The myth persists that in 1492 the Americas were a sparsely populated wilderness, a world of barely perceptible human disturbance. So I probably need to do another video on the two main times our history was rewritten. So in the early 1800s, now they can give you this narratives that America was sparsely populated. So they're using this as a time that could have been their time for repentance, and instead they want to manipulate it to say, oh, America was found this way, sparsely populated, it wasn't our fault. There is substantial evidence, however, that the Native American landscape of the early 16th century was a humanized landscape almost everywhere. Populations were large, forest composition had been modified, grasslands had been created, wildlife disrupted, and erosion was severe in places. Earthworks, roads, fields, and settlements were ubiquitous. With Indian depopulation in the wake of Old World disease, the environment recovered in many areas. A good argument can be made that the human presence was less visible in 1750 than it was in 1492. So even if you read the Book of Mormons, whether you believe it or not, it is an account that says that they were Jews that came over from the western side, California side, and they built beautiful palaces like temples, and so that they had populated America. It could be a cover story to explain, and they're trying to claim these buildings as their own and that they are the true Jews. So it could have been an account that was like forgery. But either way, there is that account. So genocide of indigenous people, colonial genocide or settler genocide. Colonization is intrinsically genocidal. By genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. There's two phases: destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed people and the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. So these people never really got caught. Even with the genocide of Jews more recently, it seems like America took a lot of these Nazis to help them do NASA and things like this. So I wonder like how many of those even got caught, though I haven't studied it that much. But we want to focus on these ones kind of pre-1950-ish. The British colonization of Ireland. Hundreds of thousands of Irish citizens. The plantations of Ireland were attempts to expel the native Irish from the best land of the island and settle it with loyal British Protestants. They too have been described as genocidal. The slaughter of Irishmen was looked upon literally as a slaughter of wild beasts. Not only the men, but even the women and children who fell into the hands of the English were deliberately and systematically butchered. Year after year, over a great part of all Ireland, all means of human subsistence was destroyed. No quarter was given to prisoners who surrendered, and the whole population was skillfully and steadily starved to death. Oh, I should have read, the Great Famine has also been blamed on British policy and called genocidal. Similar to European colonization of the Americas, the death toll under the British Empire is estimated to be as high as 150 million, a figure questioned by a sizable number of British historians. It is estimated that during the initial Spanish conquest of the Americas, up to 8 million indigenous people died, primarily through the spread of Afro-Eurasian diseases. So it doesn't make sense that one doesn't get diseases from the other. Like, how are the Afro-Eurasians fine? And I think there also are accounts of them intentionally trading things that they know have these diseases in order to wipe out the population. So that could have been a cover story that, oh, they happened to die from our diseases, but we didn't die from theirs. Simultaneously, wars and atrocities waged by Europeans against Native Americans also resulted in hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths. The population of indigenous Americas is estimated to have decreased from approximately 145 million to around 7 to 15 million between the late 15th to 17th centuries, representing a decline of around 90 to 95%. So it could have been much more, they could have been much more populated, but showing how even just with that much, how much they would have wiped out. Indigenous people, both North and South, were displaced, died of disease, and were killed by Europeans through slavery, rape, and war. In 1491, about 145 million people lived in the Western Hemisphere. By 1691, the population of indigenous Americans had declined by 90 to 95%, or by about 130 million people. It could have resulted in climate change by wiping out 90% of local populations. So it could have led to a catastrophic event by their own doing. And the large death toll also boosted the economies of Europe. So this is what we'll get to next. The depopulation of the Americas may have inadvertently allowed the Europeans to dominate the world. So that's why we have these pictures of all these empty cities and how you have this Gilded Age where a lot of these businesses also date back to this time. It's when they became stable enough to take over and repopulate these towns. It also allowed for the Industrial Revolution and for Europeans to continue that domination. Here are your people that wrote themselves as the victors and still lead the world today. Up to 8 million indigenous people died primarily through the spread of Afro-Eurasian diseases. So you think that they're still doing this today. They want to wipe us out again. And that's why the Lamb needs to respond again. The Spanish colony of Hispaniola had been reduced from 400,000 to 200 in a few decades. So because their army was not great enough to do this, they could have intentionally caused diseases on these inhabitants. I mean, if you go to one place and they catch your diseases and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wipe out this many people, then it was an accident maybe. But when this is all over the world, they are wiping out people by their diseases. I'm pretty sure that was intentional. In Canada, as a consequence of European colonization, the Indigenous population declined by 40 to 80%. And then they want to go into these points of how the colonization in Canada has inflicted each criterion for the United Nations definition of the crime of genocide. They're deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Indigenous children are disproportionately removed from their families and placed into the care of others who are often of different cultures through the Canadian child welfare system. So they're trying to help them forget their past and just accept our history that they're teaching them. But it's usually inadequate funding, poor conditions. So then that leads to the imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group within more recent years, specifically through the avoidance of informed consent. So with Canada, with America, there was the government paying their people to scalp the natives. And so also in Mexico, 1837, the Mexican state offered a bounty on Apache scalps, 100 pesos per warrior, 50 pesos per woman, and 25 pesos per child. So this is all over the world, where they're wiping out 90%, even more, of native populations just so they can take over what these people have. It couldn't have been for land anymore, or even for money. I would say that these people actually were rich, and the ones that they let live, they taught them that they used to be primitives who lived in teepees. But I think these people were not that smart, and so they wanted them to have done all the labor and built their houses, and all they did was take over and redecorate. So I think what they want is power. They want to rule the entire world with nobody opposing them. In a similar manner to the United States and Canada, the British colonization of Australia was conducted under the pretense of Indigenous lands being deemed empty in order to justify their acquisition of Aboriginal lands and deny them sovereignty or property rights. Colonization also caused a large decrease in the Indigenous population from war, newly introduced diseases, massacres by colonists, and attempts at forced assimilation. The European settlers grew rapidly in number and created entirely new societies. The Aboriginal population became an oppressed minority in their own country. I think that one place where they weren't as successful, they tried to put colonies in China, but China didn't let them. The overall gradual violent expansion of colonies into indigenous land during the Australian frontier wars lasted for centuries. Here, they're being killed for sport, and they're being regarded as vermin. So it seems that most of this colonization, this taking over the world, was done right around this time, where a lot of these colonies are being settled, or by the earthquakes of 1811. So this could have been as a result even of their own climate change, but also the Lamb is responding with wrath because it's not right. So it's been estimated by historians to be roughly 500,000 when they first came, and then by 1900 it's plummeted to fewer than 50,000. Most died due to the introduction of infectious disease that accompanied colonization. Up to 20,000 were killed due to the Australian frontier wars. Okay, so there were massacres, mass poisonings, and other actions. But also the removal of the children in order to re-educate them is described as genocidal, the stolen generation. So we see all these orphans appearing in the early 1900s. So they wanted to re-educate them and not allow them to have their own culture. All over, wherever they're settling, we see this same pattern. And also the use of medical services to Aboriginal people to administer contraceptive therapy to Aboriginal women without their knowledge or consent. So we've seen how most of America, many places of the world, their population was wiped out, about 90% by these invaders, and probably by the time of this earthquake. And so then we see these pictures of empty cities covered with mud floods, needing to be inhabited, and how they respond to this by rewriting history and by re-educating children and getting rich off of ruling the world. We have the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, where most businesses date back to, most companies, and where most of America was supposedly built. But that's going to have to be for next time. Thanks so much for joining, and Hashem bless you.